The Fruits of the Ollykin Tree by Matt Gardner. As Ollie slept, he suddenly started thinking about the hazelnuts he'd eaten earlier. He imagined himself planting one of them at the bottom of his garden. As the night wore on, he watched the hazelnut that he'd planted slowly growing into a tree. First, a tiny shoot came up out of the ground. Then, as it grew taller, 2 leaves sprouted out each side of the tiny shoot. Ollie then imagined hundreds of hazelnuts developing at the end of its branches, each one with a human face on it. This sure was a strange tree. "Hello, what's your name?" he asked the faces on the tree, but sadly he got no reply. This tree was to become even more unusual as it turned out, for being a dream, Ollie could imagine the fruit on the tree to be anything he wanted. In time, Ollie got bored with imagining the tree covered in hazelnuts. Instead, he decided to imagine it with apples on, then with pears, then with oranges, then with lemons and peaches on it. As each fruit came into his mind, he imagined picking one of them and eating them, all except for the lemon, that is. He took a bite out of a big juicy apple, then a pear, then a peach. He then imagined picking an orange from the tree, peeling it, and popping the juicy segments into his mouth, one at a time. He even imagined himself picking some bananas from the tree and eating one of those too. Getting bored with imagining fruit, Ollie then imagined the tree decorated with ornaments and with a huge pile of presents beneath it. Ollie then pictured his hazelnut tree, adorned with tiny packages hanging from each of the tree's branches, each one tied up with a lace bow. He imagined himself opening them one at a time to see what was inside them. He imagined himself stuffing all the toys and presents from the tree into a big sack and taking them to all the houses where children lived. He imagined all their faces as they opened these magical gifts. He mentally pictured them opening each one. "Wow!" they said with great pleasure. "That's just what I wanted!" Ollie then left them to play with their presents. A short time later, Ollie, Mr. Cobb and Mr. Jackson set off on their way to the showground, eager to set up their table at the show and decorate it as best they could, ready for when the judges came round to look at the vegetables Ollie had grown. Under Mr. Cobb's guidance, they put a black velvet curtain over the table and then arranged the vegetables in order of their size and colour. Mr. Jackson and Mr. Cobb then stepped back away from the table with the intention of letting Ollie take full credit for all the hard work he had put in. Nervously, Ollie stood waiting for the judges to arrive. He was the youngest person there, and this worried him a little, as he wasn't sure that the judges would take him seriously or believe that he had grown the crops himself. He needn't have worried, though, for when the judges eventually arrived, they saw Mr. Jackson and Mr. Cobb standing nearby, and so they knew that he was a genuine entrant. "Did you grow all of these yourself, lad?" one of the judges asked with a kindly smile on his face. "Yes, sir, I did," replied Ollie, before adding, "Daddy's been ill, so I had to grow them for him this year." Knowing Mr. Jackson as a previous winner of the show, the judge decided to probe a bit deeper, which worried Ollie greatly. "What's the problem with your health, Mr. Jackson?" the judge asked him. Mr. Jackson then explained how he'd hurt his back and hadn't been able to do any gardening since then. He then asked Mr. Cobb if he'd had much to do with the growing of Ollie's vegetables. "Oh, no," Mr. Cobb told him. "I've only given him a bit of advice every now and then. The lad's done all the work." "It's true. Hasn't the lad done well?" Mr. Jackson then added proudly. Knowing Mr. Jackson and Mr. Cobb to be very honest men, the judge was then satisfied that Ollie was a genuine entrant, and he then joined the rest of the judges as they moved on to look at the other tables. A short time later, Ollie and all the other exhibitors were asked to leave the tent whilst the judges made up their mind as to who the winners of the competition would be. Mr. Cobb and Mr. Jackson felt that Ollie would certainly win something, even if it were only a bronze medal, as there were many different classes within the show. Even if his marrows didn't win a prize, they thought his tomatoes or cucumbers would. In Ollie's final dream of the night, he pictured himself being the owner of a large farm. Ollie imagined himself going through a whole season on the farm, looking after all the crops and animals. He imagined himself walking round the farmyard early in the morning with a brightly coloured cockerel crowing loudly on a nearby gatepost as the sun started to rise on a fine spring morning. After saying, "Good morning, Mr. Cockerel," to the cockerel perched high on a gatepost, and to a nearby group of hens scratching about in the mud beneath the cockerel's perch, Ollie then went out into a nearby field. He then rounded up the cows and took them into the milking parlour ready for the dairyman to milk them. With that job done, Ollie then imagined himself talking to his staff who'd just arrived for work and giving them their jobs for the day. Ollie then imagined himself going over to the farm stables to talk with the ploughmen to discuss their jobs for the day as they got their horses ready for a long day's work. Ollie then pictured himself walking round the farmyard and feeding the rest of the animals. "Good morning, Mr. Bull," he announced as he passed the bull pen. He then set off for a tour round the farm, stopping briefly at the pigsties to feed the pigs, before moving on to check on the sheep. As he rounded the corner of the yard, he spotted the shepherd nursing some newborn lambs in the sheep pens. "How's it going?" Ollie asked the shepherd. "Oh, very well, Ollie," came his cheery reply. "We've had another 20 lambs born overnight," he told Ollie excitedly. With that piece of good news, Ollie then went out to look at his crops. Ollie then pictured the farm a few weeks later. He imagined spring lambs jumping around in the sunshine, planting rows and rows of potatoes and a cloud of blossom covering the orchard. Ollie imagined himself sending large truckloads of food overseas to those in need. He imagined seeing their happy, smiling faces when the food arrived in their villages, just as he'd seen their happy, smiling faces on the Ollykin tree earlier. He then imagined himself travelling by boat and aeroplane to various parts of the world where droughts and floods had taken place, and giving his produce to those in need. "Oh, thank you. I don't know how we would have survived without your help," they would tell him gratefully.